First up is The Smashing Machine. This is a biopic about MMA fighter Mark Kerr, and it stars The Rock and Emily Blunt. And I would like to set some expectations about this film because, unfortunately, the expectations that were set for me, I think, negatively colored my experience with this. I don't think this is a bad film. However, this film had just won the Silver Lion Award for Best Director at the Venice Film Festival for Benny Safdie, and I saw it shortly after, and I went, what cut of this film did they see that I didn't get to see? And people are talking about an awards bid for The Rock, and it's transformative and all this stuff, and I want to be clear, I think The Rock gives a very solid performance in this. I've always thought The Rock he's a great entertainer, and I do think he has moments where he's a good actor. However, calling this transformative for him is kind of ridiculous. The Rock is a superior elite athlete playing a superior elite athlete. In terms of the boisterousness of the role, it's maybe a little more muted than some of his, hardcore action stuff. And also in terms of his, broader family comedy stuff. So there's that, but it's not transformative. In fact, I was like, this is basically The Rock a lot of the time. Emily Blunt is good. Her character is so poorly written, it's not even funny. This might be a problem with the actual person who she's portraying, but, they are in the world's most toxic relationship, it seems like. I should also caveat, I am not an MMA person. I didn't know who Mark Kerr was. I don't have any particular affinity for it. I'm not against it, but I assume that there is an audience of MMA, fans and fans of the history of the sport that will get more out of this than the average audience. But I would say, I don't know if The Smashing Machine does the greatest job of communicating the importance he had on this sport. I will say the person who I thought did the best job in the film is Ryan Bader, who is an actual MMA fighter who's making a acting debut, I believe. He plays another real-life fighter called Mark Coleman, who is friends with Mark Kerr. So overall, this is a sports biopic. If you like sports biopics, this is pretty solid in the grand scheme of things. It is certainly not going to be genre-defining. There are a couple things that it does to semi-attempt to subvert kind of some of the structure of that, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really either succeed or it doesn't commit to it. So if you like a sports biopic, that's fine. You're going to have a fine time at The Smashing Machine. If you don't like people beating each other to a bloody pulp, you're going to hate The Smashing Machine. I think one of the most successful things and one of the things that you can tell that Benny Safdie really loves is the actual fights. They're shot very well. They're choreographed very well. They are brutal, and I think they do a good job of communicating how hardcore MMA is. But from a larger storytelling perspective, the story of this man who, goes on his ups and downs in his fighting career and deals with physical injury and all this other stuff. It's just like, we've seen this before, and I feel like we've seen it better. Like I said, Dwayne Johnson is giving a kind of more dialed in performance here, but I think, and maybe this is me being generous towards his entire career, I think this is something that he has been capable of before. I wasn't like, oh my God, I can't believe The Rock can act. Emily Blunt was a tough one in this. I don't blame her. I blame, like I said, the writing of her character. She plays Mark Kerr's girlfriend, Dawn Staples. Like I said, very toxic relationship. I feel like the film is not kind to her. I'm not saying the film needs to be kind to her if that's how she was, but it does make it tough to watch. And I do kind of worry that there's this sort of misogynistic bent to this. I feel like she might get blamed for, two-way blame relationship. So should you go see The Smashing Machine? Like I said, if you are fine with a kind of pretty cookie cutter sports film, yeah, this is a totally fine film to see. If you are expecting an Academy Award winning performance and you think you're going to see something out of Dwayne Johnson that you've never ever seen before, or maybe never seen from anyone, no, this is not that. Like, my parents were asking me about it, and my dad to a degree likes a Rocky or a sports film, etc., but he's not like the biggest fan. And so I was like, I think you can wait till this comes out on home entertainment, because the rest of the emotional components ultimately kind of fall by the wayside in service of eventually what is a plug and play story. So if you go in with your expectations set, again, I would love to know what the crowd at Venice was thinking in terms of, giving, I'm not saying don't give him the award, but I was just like, I didn't see a director's touch on this that I felt like elevated it beyond anything I had seen out of other things before. Also, structurally and dialogue-wise, it falls kind of in like a middle ground of entertainment. I don't think it is particularly well written from a dialogue perspective. I didn't expect it to be initially, but then when everyone kept hyping it up, I went, okay, there's got to be something to this. And this is what frustrates me, not to tangent too much, but this is what frustrates me about award season, is that it can take something that would have been a perfectly pleasant watch. If I'd known nothing about this film going into it, I'd been like, cool, well shot sports movie. But because I went into it being told, oh, this is, an award-winning performance, and I do caveat that, given the field this year, and we haven't seen everything, there's a non-zero chance that Dwayne Johnson gets nominated for like a Golden Globe or something like that, But had I not been told that, I would have gone in and thought, okay, solid sports movie, no problem. But because the expectations were so inflated for me, I actually ended up being disappointed to a level by it. So taking all that into consideration, trying to objectively evaluate it as a film, I'm going to give this a 3.7 out of 5. The next film I have is called The Lost Bus, and this takes place during the 2018 Camp Fire, which was the deadliest fire in California. I lived through the Camp Fire. I am not directly, but I am a Californian, and I very much recall being impacted by the smoke and all of the, kind of tertiary effects of it not being exactly there. And I gotta say, as a Californian who also just lived through the LA fires, boy, howdy, was this a traumatizing film. It is directed by Paul Greengrass, who has proven himself excellent at directing these kind of traumatizing action thrillers. He did United 93, Captain Phillips, he did some of the Bourne films. So I think the thing that works the most about this film is capturing the nightmare and logistical nightmare and kind of like bureaucratic nightmare that these fires caused, and going through the steps from different perspectives of how this got as bad as it got. Again, as a Californian, I knew the second that PG&E showed up, I was like, boo, hiss, they're the bad guys. Because if you live up here, you know just how bad it got. It stars Matthew McConaughey and America Ferrera. And so Matthew McConaughey plays a school bus driver who ends up with a bus full of kids in the middle of this fire. America Ferrera plays their teacher. And so it is this literal school bus trying to navigate their way out of this absolute nightmare of a situation. I think the problem with this film is that the part of this film that works the least is the school bus lost bus part. I understand this as a conceit in order to tell the greater story of what's happening, but I feel like the film tries to shortcut setting us up to feel already kind of stressed out on behalf of Matthew McConaughey's character, where I'm like, the circumstances here clearly are going to outweigh every single thing going on in this man's personal life. Yes, it sucks that he's having a bad day and dealing with some bummer stuff, like longer term and all this stuff, but I didn't need that to feel the stakes of the situation. I think they did a good job building the stakes of the larger situation, and so it almost feels distracting, and it actually almost feels like it cheapens the story because they're trying to be like, oh no, bus full of kids, the trap, which is obviously a terrible, horrifying situation, but then make that the focus of it versus the Matthew McConaughey as their driver part of it. If you want to stress yourself out and relive the terror that was these fires, or if you want to kind of get a taste of what it felt like to live through these fires, then go ahead and watch The Lost Bus. But as a kind of dramatic piece overall, I do think its weakness is balancing the story of this lost school bus with, what is going on with the fire department, what is going on with even the bus dispatchers. It's almost more, but like I didn't need the details of Matthew McConaughey in his bus. I just needed to know that there was a bus missing. It could have actually potentially even been more stressful and effective if you didn't know what was going on exactly with the bus and you just had the dispatchers. Just throwing it out there. Yeah, this is relatively plug and play in terms of, like Smashing Machine. If anyone talks about this for awards bait, they are just, overinflating it. I think if you go in with your expectations tempered, you can respect the craftsmanship behind the larger storytelling of the fire parts of it and the organization of the town and all the smaller community folks affected. And if you are willing to tolerate the story of Matthew McConaughey and America Ferrera's characters, by all means. It's not like a fun one to watch, obviously, because it is about a disaster that ruined, homes and took lives and all this other stuff. So it's not like fun, it's not entertaining in that sense. But like I said, if you want to look at it at least as successfully, accurately, it feels like capturing the larger impact of a situation like that, I think that's where it succeeds the most. Overall, I am going to give this a 3.7 out of 5.